regularly to help you improve your English listening and writing skills. Every time you tune in, you'll hear real-life stories and examples that will help you understand English better. So, press that like button and let's get started. Let me start with a personal story. A while ago, I was talking to my friend Daniel. We were having a conversation about his job, and he mentioned that he worked in a hospital. Now, this is a small mistake, but many learners make it. The correct preposition here is at a hospital because you're referring to a place of work. So, it's not in a hospital unless you mean being physically inside it, like a patient. It's a little mistake that can change the meaning of your sentence, and that's something we'll be focusing on today. Avoiding these small mistakes. One of the biggest mistakes I see often is the confusion between since and for. Let's take another example from my experience. I was talking to my friend Sarah about a trip she took last summer. She said, "I've been living in this city since 5 years." This might sound right at first, but it's actually wrong. The correct sentence should be, "I've been living in this city for 5 years." We use since to talk about a specific point in time, like since 2020, and we use for to talk about a duration of time, like for 5 years. These small errors can make a big difference in how natural your English sounds. Another common mistake involves subject-verb agreement. This one is tricky because we don't always pay attention to it. For example, a few days ago, I was speaking with a colleague, Jack, who said, "The team are working on a new project." Here, the mistake is using are instead of is. Even though team refers to a group of people, it's considered a singular noun. So the correct sentence is, "The team is working on a new project." It's important to get this right because it affects the grammar of your entire sentence. Another mistake that learners often make is confusing adjectives and adverbs. A common error is when people say, "She sings beautiful." Here, the mistake is using beautiful instead of beautifully. Beautiful is an adjective, and adjectives describe nouns, while adverbs describe verbs. So the correct sentence is, "She sings beautifully." This might seem small, but it's important to use the right word in the right place. Now let's move on to another error many people make. A while ago, I was speaking to my friend Leo, and he said, "I don't know nothing about that subject." This is a double negative, and in English, double negatives aren't correct unless you want to emphasize something in a specific way. In most cases, you should say, "I don't know anything about that subject." It's a small mistake, but it can make your English sound less natural. Another mistake I've heard from learners is mixing up the words borrow and lend. For example, I once had a conversation with my friend Emma where she said, "Can you borrow me some money?" The correct sentence would be, "Can you lend me some money?" You lend something to someone, and you borrow something from someone. It's a small difference, but it's one that can make your English sound more polished. I remember one time I was speaking to my friend Tom about his recent vacation. He said, "I have visited Paris last summer." This is another mistake learners make. When talking about something that happened at a specific time in the past, like last summer, we use the simple past tense. So the correct sentence is, "I visited Paris last summer." It's easy to mix up the tenses, but once you practice, it becomes second nature. In English, we also have to be careful with the use of much and many. I remember once I told a friend, "There's much people in the room." The mistake here is using much with a countable noun. Much is used with uncountable nouns, like water, sugar, or time. The correct sentence would be, "There are many people in the room." This is a mistake that's easy to make, but understanding when to use much or many will help you sound more fluent. Let's continue with more real-life examples to help you avoid common mistakes. I remember one afternoon, I was helping my friend David write a formal email. He wanted to say he was looking forward to hearing back from someone, but what he wrote was, "I look forward to hear from you." This is a mistake many English learners make. After the phrase look forward to, we always use the ing form of the verb. So the correct sentence is, I look forward to hearing from you. It's a small change, but it makes your sentence grammatically correct. Here's another one I heard from my neighbor Susan. She said, I didn't went to the market yesterday. This is a mistake with verb tenses. After didn't, we always use the base form of the verb. So instead of didn't went, it should be, I didn't go to the market yesterday. This rule is the same with all verbs in negative sentences, using did. Now, let's talk about pronunciation mistakes that can lead to confusion. My friend Andrew once told me, I want to order a dessert. He meant to say dessert, the sweet food we eat after a meal. But he used the word desert, which is a hot, dry place. The pronunciation and spelling are different, and if you're not careful, you might say the wrong word. That's why listening carefully and practicing your pronunciation is so important. Next, let's look at word order. My friend Helen was telling me about her routine, and she said, I every morning run in the park. While we can understand what she meant, the correct word order in English is different. We usually place time expressions like every morning at the beginning or end of the sentence, not in the middle. The correct sentence would be, every morning I run in the park. Paying attention to word order helps your sentences flow better and sound more natural. Now, let's look at another common mistake with countable and uncountable nouns. My cousin James once said, I need some advices. In English, advice is an uncountable noun, so we don't say advices. Instead, we say, I need some advice. If you want to be more specific, you can say, I need a piece of advice. These small details can make a big difference in how natural your English sounds. Another mistake I've heard is when people mix up say and tell. For example, I asked my friend Rachel what her manager told her, and she said, he said me to finish the report. That's not correct. The correct sentence is, he told me to finish the report. We use tell when we mention the person, he told me, she told her, etc. We use say when we don't include the person. He said it was important. Here's a helpful example from a conversation I had with my coworker, Mark. He said, I am interested in learning English. That's a mistake we hear often. The correct sentence is, I am interested in learning English. Interesting describes something or someone that causes interest. Interested describes how you feel. So Mark is interested in English, and English might be interesting to him. Let's look at one more example. My friend Lisa said, I made a photo during the trip. That sounds unusual in English. The correct expression is, I took a photo. We take photos, not make them. It's another example of how using the right verb helps your sentence sound more natural. These kinds of small mistakes are common, but the good news is they can be fixed with practice. The more you listen to real English and pay attention to how words are used, the better your English will become. You can also try writing short sentences about your day using the correct forms we talked about. This helps you build stronger habits and avoid making the same mistakes in future conversations. These are just a few examples of the common mistakes I've heard or made myself in the past. By being aware of them, you can start improving your English and avoiding these small but significant errors. So, keep practicing, listen carefully to how native speakers talk, and don't be afraid to make mistakes. Remember, it's all part of the learning process. Let's continue exploring more common mistakes that English learners make, with real-life examples to help you avoid them and improve your fluency. I want to share a story from last month when I was talking to my friend Michael. He said, I've been to the store yesterday. Now, many learners mix up the present perfect tense with the simple past tense. In this case, Michael used have been, which is the present perfect, but he also mentioned yesterday, which is a specific time in the past. When you mention a specific time like yesterday, last week, or a year ago, you should use the simple past tense instead of the present perfect. The correct sentence is, I went to the store yesterday. This is one of those small mistakes that can confuse your listener, but once you understand the difference between the tenses, it'll be easier to use them correctly. Another mistake I hear a lot involves the words a little and few. These two words are often confused, but they are used differently. For example, last week my colleague Jennifer said, I have a few money. The problem here is that money is uncountable, and we should use a little instead of a few. So the correct sentence would be, I have a little money. On the other hand, we use a few for countable nouns, like books, friends, or ideas. For example, I have a few books on my desk. Getting this distinction right is important because it shows that you understand the difference between countable and uncountable nouns, which will help you sound more natural. Speaking of countable and uncountable nouns, let's look at a related mistake. My friend Peter once said, I have many furniture in my house. This sounds wrong because furniture is uncountable, so we shouldn't use many with it. The correct sentence should be, I have much furniture in my house. If you want to say a specific amount, you could say, I have a lot of furniture, or I have several pieces of furniture. It's an easy mistake to make, but once you know the rule, it's simple to avoid. Now, let's talk about the confusion between make and do. These two verbs are often used incorrectly. For example, my friend Steven said, I made my homework yesterday. This is a common mistake. We don't make homework in English. We do homework. So the correct sentence is, I did my homework yesterday. We use make for things like make a cake, make a decision, or make a phone call. We use do for activities or tasks like do the dishes, do a project, or do exercise. It's a simple distinction, but it can change the meaning of your sentence. Here's another mistake that can make your English sound a little off. I remember my friend Sophie once said, I have a big interest in photography. While we can understand what she meant, it's not the most natural way to express this idea. In English, we usually say, I'm very interested in photography. Instead of saying a big interest, we use interested with in to talk about things we enjoy or care about. This small change will make your English sound more natural. Another common mistake is with the use of much and many in questions. My friend Sarah said, How many water do you drink every day? This is a mistake because water is uncountable, so we should use much instead of many. The correct sentence is, How much water do you drink every day? On the other hand, if you were talking about countable things, like apples or books, you would use many. For example, How many apples did you eat today? This is one of those mistakes that's easy to make, but with practice, you'll get the hang of it. Now let's talk about another mistake related to tenses. I was talking to my friend Chris the other day, and he said, I have seen her yesterday. The problem here is with the use of the present perfect tense. We don't use the present perfect with specific times in the past, like yesterday or last week. We should use the simple past tense instead. The correct sentence would be, I saw her yesterday. This is an important distinction to remember because it's one of the most common mistakes English learners make when they're just starting out. Another mistake that English learners often make is using then instead of then. For example, I heard my friend John say, I will go to the store, then I will visit my mom. The problem here is the use of than. Than is used in comparisons, like better than, smarter than, or more expensive than. The correct word here should be then, which refers to time. The correct sentence would be, I will go to the store, then I will visit my mom. This is an easy mistake to make, but once you understand the difference, it's much easier to avoid. Let's also talk about the common confusion between borrow and lend. This one can be tricky because they both refer to the act of giving or receiving something. I remember a few weeks ago my friend Lucy asked me, Can you borrow me a pen? This is incorrect. The correct sentence is, can you lend me a pen? Lend means to give something to someone, and borrow means to take something from someone. So, if you want to ask someone for something, you borrow it, and if you're giving something, you lend it. A related mistake I often hear is using between when you should use among. My friend Jack once said, I need to divide the cake between my 5 friends. Since there are more than 2 people involved, the correct word here is among, not between. Between is used when we are talking about 2 things or people, and among is used when talking about more than 2. So the correct sentence would be, I need to divide the cake among my 5 friends. Another mistake I see is related to the use of have and have got. For example, my friend Amy said, I have got a car for 5 years. The mistake here is using have got with a specific time frame, like for 5 years. We don't use have got with for in this way. Instead, we would say, I've had a car for 5 years. We use have got to talk about something we own or have in the present, but when talking about a period of time, we use the simple present tense. I've had. I hope these examples are helping you to identify and correct some of the common mistakes you might be making. As you can see, English has a lot of little details that can trip you up, but by listening carefully and practicing, you'll be able to avoid these errors and speak more naturally. Keep practicing and don't get discouraged by these small mistakes. Every time you catch yourself making one of them, you're learning and getting closer to mastering the language. Remember, the more you practice, the easier it becomes to speak confidently and correctly. Let's keep going with more examples of common mistakes that English learners make and how you can avoid them in your speaking and writing. One mistake I often hear, especially from new learners, is with the word actually. Many people use it incorrectly in sentences. For example, my friend Tom once said, actually, I'm going to the supermarket tomorrow. Now, while this might seem okay, it's not the best way to use actually. It can sound like you're correcting someone, or you're sharing surprising news, when that's not what you mean. Instead of starting a sentence with actually in a situation like this, you could say, I'm going to the supermarket tomorrow. If you want to express something surprising, you might say, actually, I didn't know you were coming to the supermarket too. Or, actually, I was planning to go later. So, be careful with actually. Use it for surprising or unexpected information, not as a filler word at the beginning of a sentence. Another mistake that many learners make is with the use of some and any. For example, last week I was talking to my colleague Brian, and he said, I don't have some milk in my fridge. This is a common mistake. In negative sentences and questions, we use any instead of some. So the correct sentence is, I don't have any milk in my fridge. However, when you make a positive statement, you can use some. For example, I have some milk in my fridge. You'll also use some when you offer or ask for things, like, would you like some coffee? Or, can I have some water? So remember, any is used in negative sentences and questions, and some is used in positive sentences or requests. Here's another error related to verb tenses. My friend Harry said, I have finished my project last week. Now, if you listen closely, you'll notice something is off here. The present perfect tense, have finished, is used to talk about actions that happened in the past, but it doesn't include a specific time. Since Harry mentioned last week, which is a specific time in the past, he should use the simple past tense instead. The correct sentence would be, I finished my project last week. When you mention specific times, like yesterday, last year, or in 2005, always use the simple past tense. The present perfect is for actions with no specified time, like, I have finished my project, without saying when. Let's talk about the difference between borrow and lend, since this is something that often confuses learners. I remember my friend Emma said, Can you borrow me your pen? It's an easy mistake, but the correct sentence should be, Can you lend me your pen? Lend means to give something to someone, while borrow means to take something from someone. So, when you're asking for something, you borrow it. And when you're giving something, you lend it. It's a simple rule, but it's very important to use these words correctly to avoid confusion. One mistake that many learners make is using the wrong form of the with countable and uncountable nouns. For example, I was chatting with my friend Mark the other day, and he said, "I bought a bread." This sounds strange because bread is an uncountable noun, and we don't use a before uncountable nouns. The correct way to say it would be, "I bought some bread." If you are talking about a specific kind of bread, like a loaf, you could say, "I bought a loaf of bread." But if you're talking about bread in general, use some instead of a. So, if you ever find yourself talking about food or other uncountable things, remember to use some or just the noun alone without a. For example, "I bought some cheese," not a cheese. Another mistake I hear a lot is using few when you should be using a few. I remember when my friend Liam said, "I have few things to do today." It sounded a little odd, and I explained that few has a negative meaning, suggesting a smaller amount than expected. If you want to sound more positive, you should say, "I have a few things to do today." A few means some things, but not many, and it doesn't have that negative feeling. So, when you want to talk about a small but positive number of things, use a few. But when you use few without a, it can sound like you don't have enough or that you have less than expected, which can sometimes sound a bit negative. Next, let's talk about the confusion between since and for. A few days ago, my friend Robert said, "I've been living here since 2 years." This is a common mistake. When you talk about how long you've been doing something, you use for when talking about a period of time, like 2 years. The correct sentence would be, "I've been living here for 2 years." Since is used for a specific point in time, such as since 2010 or since I moved here. So, to fix the mistake, always remember, use for periods of time and use since for specific points in time. Another mistake I often hear is the mix-up between bring and take. This is one of those tricky pairs of words that causes confusion, because they're both related to movement, but the direction is different. I was talking to my friend Tom the other day, and he said, "I will take this book to my friend tomorrow." This sentence is actually correct, but when he said, "I will bring the book to the park," it sounded wrong. The reason is, when you're moving something toward the person you're talking to, you use bring. But when you're moving something away from the person or from your location, you use take. So the correct sentence would be, "I will bring the book to the park if you're already there." But if you're moving it to a different place from where you are now, you would say, "I will take the book to my friend's house." Here's another issue that comes up with verb tenses, especially with have and had. My friend Jane said, "I have gone to the store yesterday." This is a common mistake. When we talk about a past action that's finished, we use the past tense, not the present perfect. The correct sentence would be, "I went to the store yesterday." The present perfect is used when the action is connected to the present moment, like, "I have visited London," meaning I visited it at some point and it's important to the current situation. But if you're talking about something that happened at a specific time in the past, like yesterday, you should use the past tense instead of the present perfect. Another common mistake is using make and do incorrectly. This is something I've heard from learners many times. For example, my friend Claire once said, "I need to do a cake for my daughter's birthday." The mistake here is that you should use make instead of do when referring to creating or preparing something. So the correct sentence would be, "I need to make a cake." Make is used for actions like creating, building, or producing something, like make dinner or make a decision. On the other hand, do is used for tasks or activities that don't involve creating something, like do your homework or do the dishes. Let's talk about another mistake that happens with the use of some and any. A few weeks ago, I heard my friend Simon say, "Do you want some water?" while we were in a restaurant. Now, this sounds perfectly fine in most contexts, but when you're in a question, especially when asking for something you're offering, it's better to use any instead of some. The correct sentence should be, "Do you want any water?" when you're offering something, or in a situation where you're not sure if the person wants it. Some is used in positive statements and requests, while any is used in questions and negative sentences. For example, "I don't have any water, but I have some water." Moving on, let's talk about the use of much and many. A few days ago, my friend Helen asked, "How much books do you have?" This is a mistake because much is used with uncountable nouns, and many is used with countable nouns. Since books are countable, the correct question should be, "How many books do you have?" For uncountable things, like, "How much sugar do you want?" use much. But when you're talking about things you can count, like pens, apples, or chairs, use many. So, remember, use much for uncountable things and many for things you can count. Now, let's look at a mistake that's related to the use of articles. A and an. I was chatting with my friend Matt recently, and he said, "She's a honest person." This is a small mistake, but it's easy to fix. The rule is, we use an before words that start with a vowel sound and a before words that start with a consonant sound. Since honest begins with a vowel sound, the O sound, you should say, "She's an honest person." It's a small detail, but getting it right will make your English sound more natural. So, the key is to listen to the sound at the beginning of the word, not just the letter it starts with. Another mistake I see a lot is the incorrect use of who and whom. I was talking to my friend Jack the other day, and he said, "This is the person who I gave the book to." Now, this is one of those mistakes that even advanced learners sometimes make. The correct sentence should be, "This is the person whom I gave the book to." Whom is used as the object of a verb or preposition, while who is used as the subject. It's a tricky one, but it's important to get it right in formal writing and speech. And here's one last mistake to cover for today, using then and then incorrectly. I've seen this one so many times. My friend Gary once said, "She's taller than me." The mistake is using then, which refers to time or sequence, instead of than, which is used for comparisons. The correct sentence would be, "She's taller than me." So, remember, use then when comparing things, and then when talking about time or sequence. Now that we've covered all these examples, remember that learning a language takes time and practice. Even if you make mistakes, you're still learning and improving. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep making progress. Don't worry about mistakes. Just keep going and you'll get there. Keep an eye on your progress and don't be afraid to make mistakes. Keep practicing and you'll sound more natural in no time. Let's continue with even more examples to help you avoid common mistakes. Understanding these errors and how to fix them will definitely improve both your listening and writing skills. So, let's dive in. Another common mistake I hear from learners is the incorrect use of "I am agree" instead of "I agree." This happens because many learners try to translate directly from their native language, where you might say something like "I am agree," which sounds correct in their language. But in English, we don't use the verb to be with the verb agree. Instead, you simply say "I agree." So remember, no need for am or is in that sentence. You just say, "I agree with you," or "I agree on that." It's simple, but it's an important thing to get right to sound natural in English. Now, let's talk about a mistake related to much and many once again, but this time in a slightly different context. This is a classic confusion. Much is for uncountable nouns, and many is for countable nouns. However, learners often mix them up when it comes to questions. For example, I was chatting with my friend Tom a while ago, and he said, "How much people are coming to the party?" The mistake here is that people is a countable noun, so we should use many, not much. The correct question would be, how many people are coming to the party? If we were talking about something uncountable, like water, we would ask, how much water do you need? Remember, much for uncountables and many for countables. Just keep this in mind when asking questions. Next up, let's talk about the difference between few and a few. This is another common mistake, and it can change the meaning of your sentence. I remember when my friend Jack said, "I have few friends in this city." This sounded negative because few suggests a very small number, often fewer than you would expect. But if Jack meant to say that he had some friends, but just not many, he should have said, "I have a few friends in this city." A few is a positive way to talk about a small number of things. Few, on the other hand, is negative and can sound like you don't have enough. So, remember, a few means a small but positive number, and few means fewer than expected, usually with a negative tone. Another mistake I often hear is using can instead of could when talking about past ability. For instance, I was talking with my friend Mark, and he said, "When I was younger, I can swim very well." The mistake here is using can when talking about something in the past. The correct sentence would be, "When I was younger, I could swim very well." Can is used for present ability, while could is used for past ability. If you want to talk about a skill or ability in the past, always use could instead of can. It's a subtle mistake, but it's important to get it right, especially when you're talking about past experiences. Now, let's talk about there is and there are. These phrases are used to describe the existence of something, but many learners use them incorrectly. For example, I remember my friend David said, "There is many people in the room." The mistake here is that we should use are with many because we are talking about a plural noun, people. So the correct sentence would be, "There are many people in the room." There is used for singular nouns, like there is a cat on the table. But when you're talking about more than one thing, you have to use there are, like there are 2 cats on the table. So just remember, is for singular, are for plural. Let's move on to another small mistake I often hear when people are making comparisons. For instance, a few days ago, I was talking to my friend Emily, and she said, "I am better in English than my friend." This is very close to being correct, but it's a little off. The mistake is that we don't need the preposition in this sentence. The correct sentence would be, "I am better at English than my friend." The verb better is used with the preposition at when talking about a skill or ability. So always say, "I am better at English," not better in English. Remember, when you're comparing skills or abilities, use at. Here's another one. The use of so and such. This mistake is something I've heard from learners many times. For example, my friend Sarah said, "I had such a good time at the party last night." This sentence is actually correct, but let me explain why. Such is used when we want to emphasize something with an adjective or noun. For instance, "It was such a beautiful day." Now, if we were to use so, we would need an adjective after it. It was so beautiful. So, the difference is that we use such for emphasizing a noun or a noun phrase. And so when we want to emphasize the adjective itself, for example, "It was so cold outside," versus "It was such a cold day." The important thing here is to remember the structure. So plus adjective, such plus noun or noun phrase. Another mistake that happens a lot is mixing up since and for. I've heard this mistake from many learners, including my friend Michael. He said, "I've lived here since 5 years." But this is not quite right. We use since for a specific starting point in time, like since 2010 or since last summer. If you want to talk about a period of time, like 5 years, you should use for not since. So the correct sentence would be, I've lived here for 5 years. For is used for durations of time, like 2 weeks, 5 years, a month, while since is used when you're referring to a specific starting point. Now, let's talk about the confusion between bring and take again. This time, I want to focus on the use of bring when you're talking about actions in the past. For instance, I was talking to my friend John, and he said, I took the cake to the party yesterday. This is correct. But then he said, I bring the cake to the party yesterday. This is wrong because we need to use brought instead of bring in the past tense. The correct sentence would be, I brought the cake to the party yesterday. So remember, bring is for the present and future, and brought is the past tense form. And let's not forget about the use of say and tell. A lot of learners get confused between these two verbs. For example, my friend David said, she told me that she say the news. The mistake here is that we need to use said instead of say when talking about something in the past. The correct sentence would be, she told me that she said the news. Say is used for direct speech, or when you're mentioning the words someone spoke, he said, I'll be there soon. But when you use tell, you're usually talking about giving information. She told me the news. And here's another one. Many learners mix up few and a few again. But this time, let's talk about it in a question. For example, I heard my friend Alex say, do you have few money? The mistake is using few when you're asking about a small amount of something. The correct way to ask would be, do you have a few dollars? A few means a small positive number, so it's the right word to use in this situation. Few would be used for something negative, like, I have few dollars, which sounds like you don't have enough. So, as we've covered in today's session, there are many small mistakes that can make your English sound less natural, but with practice, you can avoid them. Keep listening to real-life examples, paying attention to how native speakers use these words and phrases, and keep practicing your speaking and writing. Let's keep going with more examples of common mistakes and ways to fix them. Each of these mistakes might seem small, but once you correct them, your English will sound much more natural, and that will help you in real-life situations. First, let's look at the confusion between lending and borrowing. This is one of those small mistakes that can cause confusion. A while ago, I was talking to my friend Sarah, and she said, "Can you borrow me some money?" The problem with this sentence is that she used borrow instead of lend. In English, we borrow something from someone and we lend something to someone. So the correct sentence would be, "Can you lend me some money?" If Sarah was asking to take the money, she could say, "Can I borrow some money from you?" Just remember, lend is when you give something to someone, and borrow is when you take something from someone. Another small mistake that I've noticed among English learners is the use of less and fewer. This happens because in some languages, people use the same word for both. For example, I was speaking to my friend Tom the other day, and he said, "There are less people at the party than I expected." Now, this is a common mistake, but it's easy to fix. When you're talking about things that can be counted, like people, you should use fewer, not less. So the correct sentence would be, "There are fewer people at the party than I expected." On the other hand, we use less with uncountable things, like water, sugar, or money. For example, "There is less water in the bottle than I thought." So, just remember, fewer for countable nouns, people, cars, books, and less for uncountable nouns, water, rice, money. Now, let's talk about prepositions, which can be tricky in English. I often hear learners making mistakes with phrases like on the weekend versus in the weekend. For example, my friend Mark once said, "I usually go hiking in the weekend." While this might sound okay in some languages, in English, we say on the weekend. So the correct phrase would be, "I usually go hiking on the weekend." Similarly, If you are talking about a specific time period in the future or past, you would use in for months, years, seasons, or longer periods. For example, I will visit you in July, or I went to London in 2015. But for weekends, use on I relax on weekends. Just be mindful of this little detail in your conversations. A similar confusion happens with at and in when talking about places. I remember once when my friend James was telling me, I was at London last summer. He was trying to talk about his trip to London, but he used it instead of in. The mistake is that when talking about cities or countries, we say in, not at. So the correct sentence would be, I was in London last summer. At is usually used for specific places like a building or an event. For example, I am at the park or I am at the concert. So, just keep in mind that we use in for cities, countries, and larger areas, but use at for more specific locations. Now, let's discuss the difference between watch and look. This one confuses a lot of people. I was talking with my friend Olivia the other day, and she said, I watch out of the window every morning. She made a little mistake here. Watch is used for things that you pay attention to for a period of time, usually for entertainment or interest, like watching TV or watching a movie. But when you are talking about looking at something without necessarily focusing on it, we use look. So the correct sentence would be, I look out of the window every morning. If you are sitting by the window and just glancing at what's outside, you would say, I look out of the window. On the other hand, if you're sitting down and paying close attention to a movie or a game, you would say, I'm watching the game. Let's move on to the confusion between since and for, especially when talking about the present perfect tense. Many learners make the mistake of using since when they should use for. A friend of mine, Lisa, said, I've lived here since 3 years. The mistake here is that since is used to talk about a starting point in time, like since 2010 or since last year. But when you are talking about a duration of time, you need to use for instead of since. So the correct sentence would be, I've lived here for 3 years. If you want to talk about when something started, you can use since. Like, I've lived here since 2018. So just remember, since is for a point in time, and for is for a period of time. Another common mistake is the use of borrow and lend in the past tense. For example, I was talking to my friend Paul last week, and he said, I borrowed him my book yesterday. The problem here is that Paul used borrowed when he should have used lent. The correct sentence would be, I lent him my book yesterday. You borrow something from someone, but you lend something to someone. So to fix this, Paul should have said, I lent him my book. This can be a little tricky because in many languages, you don't have a separate verb for these actions, but in English, they are different. Let's look at another mistake, the use of to and very. This is a small mistake, but one that can change the meaning of your sentence. A few days ago, I was talking with my friend Anna, and she said, this cake is too delicious. The problem with this sentence is that too means more than enough. It suggests that something is excessive. So if you say, this cake is too delicious, it might sound like you can't eat it because it's too much. If Anna wanted to say that the cake was really good, she should have used very instead of too. The correct sentence would be, this cake is very delicious. Remember, use very for something you really like or find impressive, and use to when something is excessive or more than necessary. Another error that often happens is the confusion between everyday and everyday. A friend of mine, Ben, said, I go to the gym every day. The mistake here is that everyday is an adjective, which means common or ordinary. For example, these are everyday clothes, meaning they are casual or typical. When you want to talk about something happening each day, use every day as two separate words. So Ben should have said, I go to the gym every day. If you want to describe something you do daily, make sure to use every day, 2 words. And lastly, let's talk about using I have and I've got. Both phrases mean the same thing, but they are used differently. For instance, when talking about possessions, you can say, I have a car, or you can say, I've got a car. Both are correct, but I've got is more informal and commonly used in everyday conversations, especially in British English. My friend Richard said, I have got 3 sisters, which is also correct, but it sounds a little formal. If he wanted to sound more natural, he could say, I've got 3 sisters. Both ways are right, but the use of got adds a more casual tone to the conversation. As you can see, there are many small mistakes that can make your English sound less natural, but by practicing these details, you can improve your speaking and writing skills. Keep listening to real-life stories and examples. Pay attention to how native speakers talk, and try to correct these little mistakes in your own speech. The more you practice, Let's continue with more examples of common mistakes that English learners make. It's very important to pay attention to these small details because they will help your English sound more natural and clear. Another mistake I often hear is the confusion between will and going to when talking about the future. For example, my friend David said, I will going to the park tomorrow. He was trying to talk about his plans for tomorrow, but he made a little mistake by mixing up the 2 ways we express the future in English. The correct sentence would be, I'm going to the park tomorrow. When we talk about a plan or something we decided to do before now, we use going to. But when we want to talk about something we are sure will happen in the future, we use will. So you can say, I will call you later, when you are talking about something you plan to do. On the other hand, when you already have a plan, you say, I'm going to the park tomorrow. Now, let's discuss the difference between much and many. I often hear learners use them incorrectly because in some languages, there is only one word for both. For example, I was talking to my friend Jake, and he said, I don't have much friends. This is a mistake because much is used with uncountable nouns like water, sugar, or homework. When you are talking about countable things, like friends, books, or apples, you should use many. So the correct sentence would be, I don't have many friends. You can say, I don't have much money because money is uncountable. Just remember, much for uncountable nouns and many for countable nouns. Moving on, another common mistake involves the use of who and whom. This one can be tricky for even native speakers sometimes, but it's important to understand the difference. I was talking to my friend Sam last week, and he said, Who did you give the book to? The sentence is actually correct, but when you use whom, it sounds more formal. In casual conversation, we use who almost all the time, especially when it's the subject of the sentence. However, whom is used when it's the object. For example, to whom did you give the book is more formal, but in everyday conversation, it's okay to use who even when whom is technically correct. So, you could say, who did you give the book to? And it would be perfectly fine in informal situations. Next, let's talk about the confusion between advice and advise. I once had a conversation with a student named Mark who said, I advise to go to the doctor. The mistake here is that advise is the verb and advice is the noun. When you want to give a suggestion, you should use advise. So the correct sentence would be, I advise you to go to the doctor. On the other hand, if you are talking about the suggestion or the recommendation itself, you should use advice. For example, my doctor gave me good advice. So just remember, advise is the action to suggest, and advice is the thing you give, a suggestion or recommendation. Another mistake that many learners make is with the words bring and take. These 2 verbs are often confused because both involve moving something, but they are used in different situations. A few weeks ago, I was talking to my friend Alan, and he said, I'll bring my umbrella to the office. Alan made a small mistake here. We use bring when we are moving something toward the speaker, but we use take when we are moving something away from the speaker. So if Alan is going to the office, he should say, I'll take my umbrella to the office. If he was already at the office and was coming home, he would say, I'll bring my umbrella home. Just think about whether the action is moving toward you or away from you. Bring is toward, and take is away. Let's talk about between and among, another common mistake. My friend Steve once said, there was a disagreement between the three of us. This is actually a very common mistake, but it's easy to fix. We use between when we are talking about two people or things. For example, the conversation was between John and Lisa. But when we talk about three or more things, we use among. So Steve should have said, there was a disagreement among the three of us. You can say, there was a disagreement between Lisa and Tom, but if you're talking about a group, use among. Now, let's look at the confusion between borrow and borrow from. I was talking to my friend Tim last weekend, and he said, can I borrow this book from you? While this may sound okay, the confusion comes in when you're using borrow in the wrong way. Borrow is the action of taking something from someone, but when you're using borrow in a sentence, you don't need the from. You can just say, can I borrow your book? On the other hand, when you're saying borrow from, you're talking about the person or place you are taking the item from. For example, I borrowed the book from the library. Another small mistake that learners make is confusing leave and let. These two words are used in different contexts, and the difference can be confusing. For instance, I was talking with my friend Rachel, and she said, I let my keys on the table. The mistake is using let instead of leave. Let means to allow or give permission for something, while leave means to put something down or to depart from a place. So, Rachel should have said, I left my keys on the table. You can use let when you want to talk about allowing someone to do something. For example, I let my friend borrow my car. But when talking about putting something somewhere, we use leave. I left my keys on the table. Another mistake I often hear is the misuse of few and a few. They sound similar, but they mean different things. My friend James was saying, I have few books at home. The problem here is that few has a negative meaning. It means not many, or barely any. If James wants to say he has some books, he should say, I have a few books at home. A few means a small number, but not too few. It's more positive. So remember, few means not many, and a few means some. Let's finish off this section with one more mistake. Bring versus take in the past tense. I was talking to a friend named Jack, and he said, I took the book with me to the office yesterday. This is correct, but he could have used bring as depending on the direction of the action. If Jack was going to the office and was talking to someone in the office, he could say, I brought the book to the office yesterday. In general, when you are moving something toward the speaker or the place you're going, use bring. When you're talking about taking something away from a place, use take. The more you practice these small corrections, the more fluent and natural your English will sound. Every little improvement makes a big difference in the long run. Keep listening, keep practicing, and you'll get there. One mistake I often hear is when people confuse since and for when talking about time. Let me explain. My friend Michael once told me, I have been living here since 2 years. This is incorrect because since is used when you want to refer to a specific point in time, like a date or a day. For example, I have been living here since 2018. The correct way to say it would be, I have been living here for 2 years. For is used when you are referring to a period of time, like 2 years, 5 months, or a week. You use since to talk about the starting point and for to talk about the duration. For example, I've known her since last year. Specific, point in time, and I've known her for 5 years. Duration of time. Let's talk about everyday versus everyday, because this is another common mistake. A few days ago, I was talking to my friend Tom, and he said, I go for a walk every day. He meant that he walks every single day, but he accidentally used the wrong form of the word. The correct phrase is every day, which means each day. So Tom should have said, I go for a walk every day. Every day is an adjective that means something is normal or typical, like in the sentence, I wear everyday shoes to work. So, remember, every day refers to the frequency, each day, while every day refers to something usual or ordinary. Now, let's talk about the confusing difference between say and tell. I had a conversation with my friend Ben, and he said, She told me that she was happy. This is correct, but sometimes learners use say and tell incorrectly. Here's the difference. We use say when we are quoting someone's exact words, and we use tell when we are sharing information. For example, you might say, She said she was happy, meaning you are directly quoting her words. On the other hand, you might say, She told me she was happy, meaning you are sharing what she communicated. So, if you want to talk about sharing information, use tell. If you are quoting someone's words, use say. You can say, He told me a great story, but you would say, He said he was tired. Another mistake involves the difference between less and fewer. This one is easy to get wrong, but it's important for making your English sound more natural. A couple of weeks ago, I was talking with my friend Alice, and she said, I have less books than you. The mistake here is that less should be used for uncountable nouns, and fewer should be used for countable nouns. Books are countable, so the correct sentence would be, I have fewer books than you. If Alice were talking about something uncountable, like money or water, then she could say, I have less money than you. So, remember, fewer for countable things and less for uncountable things. Next, let's discuss good versus well. This is one of those mistakes that many learners make, and it's easy to fix once you understand the difference. I remember a time when I was talking with my friend Jack, and he said, I play tennis very good. This is incorrect because good is an adjective, and we use it to describe nouns, like a good book or a good person. But when you're talking about how you do something, a verb, you need to use well. So Jack should have said, I play tennis very well. If you're talking about your ability to do something, you should use well. For example, she sings well. But if you want to talk about something being good, like a movie or a meal, you use good. For example, this movie is good. It's a small change, but it makes a big difference. Another mistake learners make is the misuse of to and very. This one is tricky because both words can be used to show emphasis, but they are used in different situations. For instance, I remember talking to my friend Sarah, and she said, The movie was too good. While it makes sense in some contexts, the word too usually has a negative meaning. It means more than needed or excessive. So, if Sarah wanted to say the movie was amazing, she should have said, The movie was very good. You would use too in sentences like, The music is too loud, meaning it's louder than you want. But when you want to show a strong positive reaction, you use very. For example, she's very talented, or the weather is very nice today. So, be careful with too. It's usually negative, and very is used for strong positive feelings. Let's move on to the confusion between much and many again. Even though we discussed this before, I want to give more examples. A few days ago, I was talking to my friend Laura, and she said, I don't have much friends. As we know, much is used with uncountable nouns, like water or money, while many is used with countable nouns, like friends, books, or pens. So, Laura should have said, I don't have many friends. You might say, I don't have much time today, because time is uncountable. But I don't have many things to do today, because things is countable. It's a simple rule, but it can make a big difference in how clear your English sounds. Let's talk about a mistake I hear sometimes when people confuse do and make. These two verbs are used differently, but sometimes learners mix them up. For example, I was talking to my colleague James, and he said, "I did a mistake." This is incorrect because make is the verb we use when we are talking about creating something, like making a mistake. The correct sentence would be, "I made a mistake." On the other hand, we use do for actions or tasks. For example, "I did my homework," or "I did the laundry." So remember, make for creating something, like a mistake or a decision, and do for actions or tasks, like homework or cleaning. Now, let's discuss the use of since and for again, but this time in more complex sentences. My friend Robert once said, "I've been waiting since 2 hours." While this sounds okay, the more natural way to say it would be, "I've been waiting for 2 hours." The reason is that we use since with a specific point in time, like since 5 o'clock or since last week. For, on the other hand, is used when we talk about a duration, like for 2 hours or for a week. So the next time you're talking about a duration of time, use for. And when you're talking about a specific point in time, use since. One more common mistake involves the confusion between much and many. I've talked to a lot of learners about this, and it's clear that the distinction is often unclear. When talking about things you can count, you should use many. And when talking about things you can't count, you use much. A friend of mine, Emma, said, "I don't have much books." Since books are countable, she should have said, "I don't have many books." If she was talking about something uncountable, like time, she would say, "I don't have much time." Just remember, much for uncountable nouns and many for countable nouns. Let's continue by diving deeper into more common mistakes English learners make. These mistakes may seem small at first, but by paying attention to them, you can sound much more fluent and natural in English. A mistake I often hear is the incorrect use of everyone and everybody. Although both of these words seem similar, there are small differences that can affect how your sentence sounds. I remember last week my colleague Peter said, "Everybody knows the answer to this question." This sounds fine, but sometimes learners use these words incorrectly. Everyone and everybody both mean all people or all members of a group. However, everyone is a little more formal, while everybody is more informal. So if you're in a formal situation, it's better to use everyone, like in, "Everyone at the meeting agreed with the plan." If you're in a casual conversation, everybody works just fine. "Everybody had a good time at the party." Both words are correct, but the difference is in the tone. Remember, if you want to sound more formal, use everyone, and for a more relaxed tone, use everybody. Next, let's look at the mistake of using borrow and lend incorrectly. These words can be tricky for learners, as they both involve giving and receiving, but they are used in different ways. I remember a time when I was chatting with my friend Ben, and he said, "Can you borrow me your book?" This is incorrect. When you borrow something, you are taking it from someone else. So, the correct sentence would be, "Can you lend me your book?" If you are the one giving something, you lend it. If you are the one receiving, you borrow it. For example, I borrowed a pencil from my friend, or I lent my friend my pencil. So, just remember, lend is when you give, and borrow is when you take. Another mistake I've heard many learners make is the confusion between make and do. I know this might sound a bit repetitive, but it's such a common issue that it's worth revisiting. I was once speaking with my friend Jack about his weekend, and he said, "I did a big mistake." This is a classic error. You make mistakes, decisions, and plans, but you do tasks or actions. So the correct way to say it would be, "I made a big mistake." Similarly, you could say, "I did the shopping," because shopping is a task. But when talking about a mistake or an action that has an outcome, always use make. Let's move on to another very common mistake, mixing up fewer and less. These two words can be tricky because both are used to describe a smaller amount, but they apply to different kinds of nouns. Last week, I was at a meeting with my friend Sarah, and she said, "There are less people in the office today." This is a small mistake. The word less is used for uncountable nouns like water or sugar. The correct word to use with countable nouns, like people, is fewer. So Sarah should have said, "There are fewer people in the office today." If she had been talking about an uncountable noun, like time, she could have said, "I have less time today." So remember, use fewer for things you can count, like people, books, pens, and use less for things you cannot count, like water, money, time. Another common error involves the incorrect use of tall and high. A couple of days ago, I heard my friend Emma say, "That building is so high." While this may sound okay in casual conversation, the correct adjective when describing the height of something is tall. High is used for things that are elevated or above the ground, like the high mountains or a high shelf. But when talking about the height of a person, an object, or a building, you use tall. So Emma should have said, "That building is so tall." You can use high for things like, "The tree branches are high up," or "The high shelf is difficult to reach." Just remember, tall for people, buildings, and things you measure from the ground up, and high for things that are elevated, above a certain level. Let's discuss another mistake that is common: the misuse of since and for. These two words are often confused, but they have different meanings. I remember a time when I was talking to my friend Laura, and she said, "I've been working here since 2 years." This is a common mistake. Since is used to talk about a specific point in time, like since last year or since Monday. For is used when we are talking about a period of time, like for 2 years or for 5 months. So, the correct sentence would be, "I've been working here for 2 years." If Laura wanted to refer to a specific starting point, she could say, "I've been working here since 2019. It's important to use since when you want to talk about the beginning of an action, and for when you want to talk about the length or duration of time. Here's another one: lie versus lay. I had a conversation with my friend George about his day, and he said, "I lay on the couch for 2 hours." This is a mistake because lay is a verb that means to place something down. The correct verb here is lie, which means to recline or rest. So George should have said, "I lied on the couch for 2 hours." The verb lay is used when you are placing something down, like, "I laid the book on the table." To summarize, use lie when you're talking about reclining yourself, and use lay when you are talking about placing something down. Another common issue is the misuse of borrow and lend. We've touched on this before, but let's go deeper. I remember when my friend Alex asked me, "Can you borrow me your pen?" This is a common mistake, but it's easy to fix. Borrow is what you do when you take something from someone. So, the correct sentence would be, "Can you lend me your pen?" Lend is used when you give something to someone temporarily. If Alex had been asking for the pen and was planning to give it back to me later, lend would be the correct verb. On the other hand, if I had been asking for the pen, I would say, "Can I borrow your pen?" It's a small but important distinction that can help you sound more natural in English. Let's wrap up this section with the mistake of using much and many incorrectly. We often use much for uncountable nouns, like money, water, or time, and we use many for countable nouns, like books, people, or apples. I remember my friend John once said, "I don't have much friends." This is a mistake. Since friends are countable, he should have said, "I don't have many friends." If he were talking about something uncountable, like money, he could say, "I don't have much money." Just keep in mind, many for things you can count and much for things you cannot count. It's a simple rule, but it makes a big difference in how clear your English sounds. Let's continue exploring more common mistakes that English learners make and how they can avoid them to sound more natural and fluent in English. These are mistakes. that many learners, including myself, have made at some point, and understanding them can really improve your language skills. So, let's dive right in. One mistake that I hear often is the confusion between speak and talk. These two verbs are very similar, but they are used in different ways. I remember one time when my colleague William asked me, "Can you talk English?" This is a common error. The verb talk is generally used when you're discussing an informal conversation, usually in the context of two or more people. On the other hand, speak is used when referring to formal communication or when discussing your ability to use a language. So instead of saying, "Can you talk English?" William should have said, "Can you speak English?" For example, you would say, "I can speak English fluently, but we had a great talk about the weekend plans." Remember, you speak when referring to languages or formal speaking, and use talk when you are referring to conversations or informal speaking. Another very common mistake involves the use of want and wish. These two words are often used interchangeably, but they have different meanings and uses in English. I remember a situation when my friend George said, "I wish to go to the gym tomorrow." While this might seem correct at first glance, wish is more formal and is typically used for things that are impossible or unlikely, such as, "I wish I could travel the world." On the other hand, want is used for things you hope for in the present or future. So, George should have said, "I want to go to the gym tomorrow." To sum it up, use wish for things that are unrealistic or unlikely, and want for things that are more achievable. Now, let's talk about the use of have and have got. These two expressions can be confusing because they both refer to possession, but there are slight differences. I remember once when my friend Olivia was telling me, "I have got a meeting later today." While this sounds fine in informal speech, in more formal situations, we would simply say, "I have a meeting later today." Both have and have got mean the same thing when talking about possession, but have got is used more often in British English and in informal contexts. In American English, you are more likely to hear just have. For example, "I have a car" is commonly used in American English, while "I have got a car" might be more common in the UK. Both are correct, but it's important to know when and where to use them based on the style of speech you're aiming for. Another mistake I hear often is the misuse of the word advice. Many learners confuse advice and advise. I had this happen a few months ago when my friend John said, "My teacher advised me to study harder." In this case, John made a simple mistake by using the word advised, which doesn't exist. The correct form is advised. So John should have said, "My teacher advised me to study harder." The word advice is a noun and refers to guidance or suggestions, while advise is a verb and means to give advice. Here's the difference. I need some advice from my boss, noun, and my boss advised me to take the day off, verb. Just remember, advice is the noun and advise is the verb. Let's talk about the common mix-up between make and do. This is a mistake that many learners make. I remember one time when my friend Mike said, "I will do a mistake in my presentation." While this sounds understandable, it's actually incorrect. We make mistakes, not do them. So the correct way to say it is, "I will make a mistake in my presentation." The verb do is used for actions or tasks that are specific and often involve work, while make is used for things you create or produce, including mistakes. For example, "I did my homework," task, but I made a mistake, something that was created or happened. So just remember, when it's about a mistake, use make. For tasks or actions, use do. Another mistake many learners make is using during and while in the wrong context. I remember a time when I was talking to my friend Henry about a trip he took to Italy, and he said, "I visited many cities during I was there." This sentence sounds a bit off because during should not be used with a subject and verb. The correct word to use in this case is while. So Henry should have said, "I visited many cities while I was there." During is used to talk about a period of time, such as, we stayed in Italy during the summer, while is used to connect two actions or events that happened at the same time, such as, I visited many cities while I was there. Let's also talk about the difference between since and for. These two words are used to talk about time, but they are used in different contexts. For instance, I was talking to my friend Jessica the other day, and she said, I've lived here since 5 years. This is a common mistake. The word since is used for a specific point in time, like since 2015 or since Monday. The correct sentence should be, I've lived here for 5 years. When talking about the duration of time, we use for with a period, such as for 2 days, for a month, or for 5 years. So, if you want to refer to a starting point, use since. If you want to refer to a period of time, use for. Moving on, another common mistake learners make is using the wrong preposition after certain verbs. I remember once when my friend Karen said, I'm really interested on learning Spanish. This is a small mistake, but it's important. The correct preposition to use here is in, not on. So Karen should have said, I'm really interested in learning Spanish. Some other common verbs followed by prepositions include I'm good at swimming, I'm afraid of spiders, and she's interested in art. This is one of those areas where a lot of practice. Another tricky one is the use of everyone versus everybody. Both words mean all people, but there's a subtle difference. I remember a time when my friend Daniel said, everybody loves pizza. While this is perfectly fine in casual conversation, everyone is often used in more formal contexts. So, if you're in a more formal setting, you might say, everyone should complete the assignment by tomorrow. For casual conversations, everybody is great. Everybody had a great time at the concert. Another mistake involves the use of borrow and lend. We've talked about this before, but it's so important to get it right. For instance, I heard my friend Peter say, Can you borrow me your pen? This is wrong. The correct sentence should be, Can you lend me your pen? Lend is used when you give something, and borrow is used when you take something from someone. So remember, lend means you are giving, and borrow means you are receiving. As you can see, these are common mistakes that English learners make, but with a little practice and attention to detail, you can avoid them and improve your fluency. Whether it's using the right prepositions or distinguishing between speak and talk, these small corrections can make a big difference in how natural and clear your English sounds. Just like with any skill, the more you practice, the better you'll get. So, keep listening, keep speaking, and most importantly, keep making progress. Let's continue by looking at even more common mistakes that English learners often make. These mistakes might seem small, but when you correct them, it can really help you sound more fluent and confident in everyday conversations. So, let's dive deeper into some of the most common errors I've encountered with my friends and students over the years. One mistake that I've heard many times is using much and many incorrectly. These two words are often confused, especially when learners are trying to describe quantities. I remember a time when my colleague Richard said, I don't have much friends. While it's understandable, it's not grammatically correct. The word much is used with uncountable nouns, while many is used with countable nouns. In Richard's sentence, friends is countable, so the correct sentence should be, I don't have many friends. For example, you can say, I don't have much water because water is uncountable. But you would say, I don't have many books because books are countable. This is an important distinction to remember. So, always use much for uncountable things and many for things that can be counted. Another mistake many learners make is using less and fewer incorrectly. I was talking to my friend Sarah a while ago, and she said, I have less friends than you. This is another example where the wrong word is used. Less is used for uncountable nouns, while fewer is used for countable nouns. Since friends is countable, Sarah should have said, I have fewer friends than you. Here's an easy rule. Use less when you can't count something, like water, time, or money, and fewer when you can count things, like apples, people, or books. So, instead of saying, there are less people at the party, you should say, there are fewer people at the party. One of the most confusing mistakes comes from mixing up since and for. Both words refer to time, but they're used in different ways. I remember when my friend Henry said, I've been working here since 5 years. This is a mistake because since is used to refer to a specific point in time, like a year or a date. For example, I've been working here since 2019. If you want to talk about a duration of time, like a period, you use for. So, Henry should have said, I've been working here for 5 years. For example, she's been studying English for 2 months. Or, I've been living in this city for 10 years. Since talks about the starting point of an action, and for talks about the length of time an action has been happening. Another common mistake is using everyone and everybody interchangeably without considering the context. These two words seem to have the same meaning, but everyone is slightly more formal than everybody. I was having a conversation with my friend Thomas, and he said, everybody in the office was excited for the meeting. This is perfectly fine. In casual conversation, but in a more formal context, you might prefer to say, everyone in the office was excited for the meeting. In informal settings, everybody is commonly used, but in business or formal situations, it's better to use everyone. For example, everyone should be on time for the meeting, or everybody loves a good meal. It's a small difference, but it's something to keep in mind depending on the setting. Let's now talk about the mistake that many learners make when using borrow and lend. This one is very tricky because the meaning of both words is so similar, but they are used in different ways. I remember a time when my friend Anna said, Can you borrow me your pen? This sentence sounds off because you lend something to someone and you borrow something from someone. So instead of saying, Can you borrow me your pen? Anna should have said, Can you lend me your pen? You lend something to a person and you borrow it from them. Here's an example. Can I borrow your notebook for a minute? Means you're asking to take the notebook for a short time. On the other hand, can you lend me your notebook? Means you're offering the notebook for someone else to use. Keep this distinction in mind, and you'll sound much more natural when talking about borrowing or lending. Another mistake that learners often make is using since and for with the present perfect tense. This is a bit tricky, so let's break it down. I remember talking to my friend Linda, and she said, I have worked here since 3 years. This is not quite right. The correct form is, I have worked here for 3 years. Since refers to the exact point in time something started, while for refers to the length of time. So you would say, I have worked here since 2018, exact point in time. Or, I have worked here for 3 years, length of time. This is a mistake that many learners make when using the present perfect tense, but once you get the hang of it, it becomes easier to use both since and for correctly. Now, let's discuss the difference between make and do. This is one of those common mistakes that can cause confusion. The verbs make and do are both used to refer to actions, but they're used in different contexts. I remember my friend Jacob saying, I do a mistake during the presentation. While we understand what he meant, it's not correct. The correct sentence should be, I made a mistake during the presentation. You make mistakes, decisions, and plans, and you do actions like work, exercises, or chores. For example, I made a mistake, referring to something that was done, but I do my homework, referring to an action or task. Let's also talk about bring and take, which are often confused by learners. I remember a time when my friend David said, Can you bring the book to me tomorrow? While this sentence is understandable, it's not correct in this context. The correct word to use here is bring if you are talking about bringing something from another place to the speaker. But if you are the one going to the other person's place, you should use take. So if David was at my house and I wanted him to give me the book tomorrow, I should say, "Can you bring the book to me tomorrow?" But if I am asking David to bring the book from his place to mine, I would say, "Can you take the book to me tomorrow?" The key difference here is whether the action is happening from the speaker's point of view, use bring, or from someone else's point of view, use take. Another mistake learners make is with the use of articles, like a, an, and the. I remember when my friend Thomas said, "I went to a doctor yesterday." This sentence is understandable, but the article "the" is usually used when referring to something specific. So, if Thomas had a specific doctor in mind, he should have said, "I went to the doctor yesterday." The article "a" is used for something general, like, "I went to a restaurant." But if you know which restaurant you're referring to, you would say, "I went to the restaurant." It's a small but important detail that helps you sound more accurate in your speech. These are just a few of the common mistakes that many English learners make, but by paying attention to these details and practicing regularly, you can significantly improve your English skills. Whether it's using the right prepositions or understanding how to talk about time, mastering these small areas can make you sound much more natural when speaking. So keep practicing, keep listening to real-life examples, and most importantly, keep improving your English every day.